Certain questions follow us quietly and resurface with force when we're at our most fragile. Why do we keep getting involved with those who hurt us? Why do we give so much to those who offer so little? Why, even after so many disappointments, do we persist, waiting, trying to fix what destroys us? The truth is that this kind of love, intense, painful, almost always unbalanced, is not random. It has deep, invisible roots that don't originate in the present. These roots feed on the past, on our oldest emotional history, on experiences we lived through without understanding, but that marked us forever. At first glance, it might seem like a matter of bad luck, a lack of fortune in love. But when these patterns repeat, when you realize the pain always comes with a different name but the same effect, it's time to stop looking outward and start investigating what's happening within. The love that hurts doesn't always reveal itself as such in the beginning. It arrives wrapped in promises of care, sweet words, and gestures that confuse. But little by little, it shows its true face, the one that demands, manipulates, wounds, and abandons. And yet, we stay. The answer lies far beyond logic. No one consciously chooses to suffer. What binds us to these relationships isn't love itself, but what that love triggers inside us. It touches deep layers of the unconscious, wounds we've never clearly seen, needs we've normalized, beliefs built from pain. Carl Jung said that what doesn't become conscious returns as fate, and that's what we see in relationships that hurt. The repetition of the same emotional destiny lived out in different forms. This question, why do we love those who hurt us, only begins to be answered when we look at our own history, when we realize that, at some point in life, we were taught to accept crumbs, to confuse love with absence, to call control affection, to believe that love always comes with pain. This doesn't happen because we want to suffer, but because, for many of us, pain is familiar, and the unconscious seeks what it knows, even if what it knows is suffering. When you feel you need to strive to be loved, when you're afraid to be yourself for fear of rejection, when you feel small next to someone who should lift you up, it's not the present that's failing. It's the past repeating itself. Often what we call overwhelming passion is in reality the activation of an old trauma. That person awakens feelings in you that aren't new. They're echoes of childhood, of the first rejection, the first absence, the first moment you learned you had to mold yourself to be accepted. That's why the love that hurts isn't just a bad choice. It's a reflection of your emotional history. And until that history is understood, you'll keep getting involved with people who awaken the same pains, not because you enjoy suffering, but because that's the language your unconscious learned to speak. It's as if your emotional system is programmed to seek what it knows best, even if that means returning to places that wound you. There's no easy answer to this question, but there is a path: self-awareness. It begins when you stop blaming the other and start asking what inside you accepts this kind of love. What inside you still believes you must endure pain to be worthy of affection? What inside you hasn't yet been embraced? Because no one surrenders to what hurts by conscious choice. There's something much deeper at play, something that needs to be heard, seen, and transformed. And until that happens, love will keep coming in the form of repetition, not liberation. There's a common idea that love just happens, that we stumble into someone by chance, feel an inexplicable connection, and everything unfolds from there like an unpredictable script. But when the same type of relationship repeats, when the stories change settings but keep the same pain in the plot, it becomes clear that love isn't arising from chance. There's an invisible logic behind it all, a silent pattern born within us that manifests in the kind of love we seek, or that seeks us. This pattern isn't built in the present. It forms gradually from our earliest emotional experiences. From a young age, we learn what affection is, what presence is, what abandonment is, what care is. Every look we didn't receive, every gesture we hoped for but never got, every time we were only partially seen, all of it turns into an internal guidebook about what to expect from relationships. And it's this guidebook that later steers our romantic choices, even when they hurt us. Carl Jung spoke of an unconscious field where all our repressed, forgotten, or unintegrated experiences remain alive, shaping our actions. It's in this field that the emotional pattern takes root. It doesn't show itself clearly or shout. It directs quietly, but powerfully. That's why it's not enough to pay attention to who you choose to love. You need to look at what inside you chose that person. What silent pain were you carrying when you felt drawn to them? What old need was touched by that gesture, that look, that presence? The hidden pattern often disguises itself as chemistry. You feel an intense connection with someone, an urgency, a familiarity that seems inexplicable. But it is explainable. It's just unconscious. The other person represents something your emotional system already knows. Sometimes they embody the absent father who never truly saw you, but whom you still hope to win over in other faces. Sometimes it's the critical mother who never validated who you were, now appearing as partners who diminish you or demand too much. These patterns don't sustain themselves alone. They survive because they haven't been seen, because we keep living as if loving means enduring, as if we deserve less, as if love must be earned, as if pain is a natural price to pay for having someone. And the more we avoid looking at these beliefs, the more they operate behind the scenes. That's why so many ask, why do I always end up in the same kind of relationship? The answer lies in that internal script, created by pain and repeated without awareness. And the cruelest part of these patterns is that they don't reveal themselves at the start. The love that hurts often begins with promises, with the feeling that you finally found someone different. But over time, the layers peel back and the old pattern returns. Abandonment, indifference, control, manipulation. It all seems new, but it's more of the same. And this doesn't happen because you're unlucky. It happens because there's still something unresolved in you that keeps seeking in others what you could only find within. Understanding that love follows an unconscious pattern isn't about blaming yourself. It's about freeing yourself. Because once you see this pattern, it loses its power. You start noticing the signs earlier, feeling when the old dynamic tries to repeat itself, positioning yourself differently, and little by little, what was fate becomes choice, not because the pain ceases to exist, but because you're no longer at its mercy. This is the beginning of a new way of loving, one that doesn't come from fear, need, or the urge to complete yourself through someone else. It comes from recognizing who you are, what you deserve, and what you're no longer willing to accept in the name of something that looks like love but only knows how to hurt. The pattern that leads us to love those who hurt us almost always originates in a place many avoid looking at: childhood. Not because people don't want to remember, but because they often don't realize that what they experienced as children still dictates how they love today. The way we were seen, touched, heard, or ignored during our earliest years creates an emotional imprint so deep it becomes nearly indistinguishable from what we understand as love. It's there, in that vulnerable and silent space, that the emotional script we carry through life is born. Carl Jung said that every human being carries an original wound, an emotional mark left by our first experiences with caregivers. It doesn't have to be something visibly traumatic. Sometimes the absence was subtle. A father who was present but emotionally distant. A mother who was loving but always exhausted, with no room to see her child as a whole person. Sometimes it was words spoken without intent, but that cut deeply. Other times it was constant silence. The child learns quickly, not through words but through sensations. They learn, for example, that to get attention, they must behave a certain way. That feeling too much is a bother. That wanting comfort is weakness. That crying is wrong. These small lessons repeated daily create an internal logic. That love comes with pain. That affection is scarce. That being accepted requires effort. Over time, this logic stops being seen as an adaptation. It becomes identity. You don't realize you're reproducing behaviors shaped by the wound. You just feel something's wrong with you, that you love too much, that you give yourself to the wrong people, that you attach too quickly, that you always expect more from others than they can or want to give. But deep down, it's not neediness. It's emotional survival based on an old memory. This wound isn't just a memory. It lives on inside you, acting as a filter for everything you feel. When someone ignores you, it's not just that person hurting you. It's as if the weight of every time you weren't seen in childhood crashes down again. When someone leaves without explanation, the abandonment isn't just of the present. It's the repetition of the same emptiness you felt as a child. And the most dangerous part is that unconsciously, you might start being drawn to this very kind of pain. Because it's familiar, because it reinforces a story you already know by heart. This doesn't mean the pain is comfortable, but it's recognizable. And humans, when unaware, tend to gravitate toward what they know. That's why so many of us get involved with people who emotionally resemble our parental figures, not in literal behavior, but in the energy they carry. An emotionally unavailable partner might echo the feeling of an absent father. A critical, cold partner might rekindle the pain of a demanding mother. And so, without realizing it, we return to the same place, hoping someone will give us what we never received, trying to finally fix that unresolved experience. But love doesn't heal a wound you haven't yet acknowledged. It only reveals it. And as long as that wound remains hidden, it will keep dictating your romantic choices. You'll find yourself falling for people who awaken your insecurity, who don't prioritize you, who leave you waiting, not because you deserve it, but because somehow your unconscious learned to associate that with loving. This is where self-awareness stops being a luxury and becomes a necessity. Not to change the past, but to stop repeating it. To understand that the child you were wasn't to blame, but also had no choice. Now, as an adult, you do. And that choice begins when you decide to look at the wound, not to blame or shame yourself, but to start healing it. Because no one can build a healthy love while still unconsciously trying to heal their childhood through adulthood. And no one can receive whole love while still believing they must hurt to deserve it. When someone feels in love with a person who doesn't treat them well, who doesn't prioritize them, who disappears, who confuses them, they often think this is love. That this intensity, this knot in the stomach, this anguished waiting, this emotional drama, all of it is proof the feeling is real. But what's often labeled as love isn't love. It's a visceral attachment to pain that's already known. And what's known, no matter how much it hurts, feels safe. Familiarity carries a silent weight. We grow up associating affection with certain sensations, and even if those sensations involve rejection, silence, or confusion, our emotional system registers them as love, not because we enjoy suffering, but because our body and mind were trained early on to recognize that dynamic as affection. So when we meet someone who treats us with indifference, who makes us doubt our worth, something inside us recognizes that pattern and responds with attachment. It's as if an inner part says, "This, I know. This is what I learned to call love." This is one of the cruelest tricks of an emotional wound, turning pain into desire. The more distant the other person becomes, the more you feel challenged to prove your worth. The more they reject you, the harder you try to win them over. When someone treats you with indifference, instead of walking away, you draw closer. And when someone offers you true love, consistent care, emotional presence, you get scared. You don't know how to handle it. Sometimes you even push it away. This reversal happens because your unconscious is addicted to repetition. What draws you in is often what reminds you of the emotional dynamic you experienced in childhood, even if that dynamic was marked by absence or pain. So instead of seeking relationships that nourish you, you end up involved with people who put you back in the same position as before, waiting for affection, blaming yourself for rejection, trying to be enough. That's why so many say, "I can't like people who like me," or "I fall for those who treat me badly." It's not a rational choice. It's the unconscious pattern of familiarity at work. The suffering activates the wound, and the wound reacts as it always has, trying to prove itself worthy of love. But this love that hurts isn't real. It's a distorted mirror, where you see the other as someone capable of saving you, when in reality, they're just repeating a pain already inside you. You start believing the problem is yours, that if you change, if you do more, if you become better, they'll finally see you. That's not love, that's emotional conditioning. It's a desperate attempt to heal a wound through a relationship that only makes it bleed more. Jung reminds us that the unconscious is persistent. It will repeat the same stories until you're ready to see them, until you stop confusing pain with intensity, absence with passion, abandonment with freedom. Until that happens, what you'll call love will often just be a repetition of the wound, a cycle that starts with expectation, moves through frustration, ends in pain, and begins again in another body, with another name, but with the same essence. Loving those who hurt you is, at its core, an attempt to change the past with the hands of the present. It's wanting to be loved by someone who symbolically represents the one who never loved you as you needed. But that will never work, because no current relationship can heal what you haven't yet seen within yourself. And until that confusion is unraveled, love will remain just another way to repeat the pain. What we feel for someone isn't always about who they truly are. Often the intensity of passion, the surrender, the pain we feel when they pull away, it's not really about them, but about what they awaken within us. What we love isn't the individual, but the image we've created of them. And that image, more often than not, is shaped by unconscious parts of our psyche that project onto the other everything we haven't yet recognized or integrated in ourselves. Carl Jung was one of the first to deeply explain this phenomenon. He called it projection, the process where the unconscious casts outward onto another person contents that reside within us. Projection happens when we see in someone else qualities we wish to possess, vulnerabilities we deny in ourselves, emotional aspects we don't know how to handle. In the realm of affection, this becomes even more powerful, because deep down, we desperately want to recognize ourselves. And sometimes we find that recognition in the fantasy we build around someone. You might fall for someone calm and confident, believing you love that person. But in reality, you could be projecting onto them your own need for stability, your search for peace, your longing for protection. The other becomes a canvas where you paint what you yearn for, and that's where the bond starts to distort. Because instead of seeing who they really are, with their limits, flaws, insecurities, you connect with what they represent to you, with the emotional role they've come to play. This projection can be romantic, idealized, even magical. The other turns into an emotional savior, someone who, in your imagination, will finally give you what you've always lacked. But the truth is, no human can sustain that expectation for long. Sooner or later, the image cracks. What's left is frustration, a sense of betrayal, the pain of realizing you may have loved your illusion more than the person. This isn't superficial or just a fleeting crush. Projection is a deep, subtle mechanism. It stems from the unconscious, from a real emotional need. You project onto the other because there's something inside you that hasn't been acknowledged, something crying out for space. It might be a repressed strength, a stifled sensitivity, an old need, a hidden desire. The other then becomes a mirror, and that mirror reflects parts of you that had been forgotten. That's why sometimes you meet someone new but feel like you've loved them for years. The connection is intense because it's not just with them, it's with a part of you that finally feels alive. But if that part isn't integrated, what starts as fascination turns into dependency, and what seemed like love becomes obsession. Projection also explains why we love those who hurt us. If we project our need for acceptance onto someone, any crumb of attention becomes precious. If we project our desire to be cared for, any small gesture feels profound. And so, we ignore the red flags, downplay the harm, justify what should push us away, not out of weakness, but because we're emotionally blind. We see what we want to see, and we refuse to see what's actually in front of us. But no projection lasts forever. At some point, reality breaks through, and with it comes the pain of disillusionment, not just with the other, but with the part of us that believed too much. And that pain, as hard as it is necessary, because it reveals something essential. The healing isn't in the other, but in you. What you were desperately seeking out there must first be recognized within. True emotional freedom begins when you stop projecting and start integrating, when you realize the other didn't come to complete you, but to show you what still needs to be seen in yourself. When you understand that what you most admire in them is often a reflection of something in you, waiting to emerge. Until that integration happens, love will remain more about fantasy than presence. Within each of us lies a part we don't show the world, not because it's inherently ugly or bad, but because at some point in life, we were taught to hide it. This part is what Carl Jung called the shadow. It holds everything we've rejected, denied, or repressed in our personality. Emotions, impulses, desires, vulnerabilities, unexpressed strengths. And though ignored by the conscious mind, the shadow remains alive. It acts, especially in our relationships. When you fall for someone who causes you pain, who triggers your deepest fears, who makes you feel small, insecure, or unworthy, there's a deeper message at play. That person isn't just hurting you, they're activating your shadow. Through the relationship, they're revealing aspects of yourself you haven't yet embraced. Unknowingly, they become a distorted mirror of your hidden self, and the stronger the connection, the more intense that activation becomes. It's no coincidence when you find yourself with someone controlling, if you've spent your life suppressing your own anger. Nor is it random when you fall for someone needy if you grew up believing you had to be strong all the time. The shadow doesn't fade with time. It shows up in other ways, in the partners you choose, in how you let yourself be treated, in the dynamics that draw you in, and perhaps most surprising is realizing that you don't just attract people who mirror your shadow. You might also embody the shadow of the other. Someone who seems to love you and then suddenly pulls away may have seen in you something that confronts a part of themselves they're not ready to face, something that scares them, challenges them, forces them to change. Because loving, when the shadow is involved, isn't just a sweet gesture. It's an intense, uncomfortable, often chaotic experience. Deep relationships are like illuminated mirrors. They show what everyday life conceals. True love doesn't just expose our beauty, it lays bare our contradictions, our wounds, our emotional addictions. And if we're not ready for that, we risk rejecting the other, not for who they are, but for what they force us to see in ourselves. That's why the pain you feel beside someone might actually be a sign that there's something within you needing integration. The person who rejects you could be reflecting your own struggle to accept yourself. The relationship that suffocates you might be showing how much you still hide from yourself. And the hardest part, what humiliates you, may be revealing the part of you that still believes it deserves humiliation. Jung said that the shadow, when unrecognized, rules your life, and we still call it fate. But the shadow isn't a punishment. It's an invitation, a quiet call to look at yourself with more courage, to stop pretending it doesn't hurt, to acknowledge your own wounds, your unexpressed anger, your unadmitted neediness, your fear of abandonment, your need for control disguised as love. That's all shadow, and the more we deny it, the more it manifests outside us. Many of those who hurt us unknowingly help us touch these layers. They make us feel what we need to feel to stop running. They bring us into contact with emotions we've avoided for years, and contrary to appearances, that contact can be the start of transformation, but only if you're brave enough not to blame the other and instead use the experience as a mirror for your own inner journey. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be seen. It seeks space, not dominance, integration, not denial. And when you begin this work, embracing your forgotten parts, accepting your full humanity, something shifts. You stop being drawn to relationships that wound you, because you no longer need someone to show you your pain. You've learned to face it on your own. We often think we form relationships to get to know others better, to understand their stories, their emotions, their ways of loving. But what we rarely realize is that in every relationship we experience, the greatest lesson isn't about the other, it's about ourselves. Every deep emotional connection is a mirror, a reflection, a silent invitation to see what we can't perceive alone. The other becomes the stage where our wounds, masks, and deepest truths take shape. Jung said that nothing outside us affects us so deeply unless it touches something already within. When someone sparks uncontrollable love, sudden insecurity, consuming jealousy, or unexpected anger in you, that person is revealing something that was already there. They didn't create it, but they're showing it to you clearly, something you'd been trying to hide. That's why certain relationships shake us so profoundly, not because of what the other does, but because of what they awaken in us. You might think you fell for someone sweet, when really what hooked you was the feeling of being seen for the first time. You might believe you're suffering from abandonment, but deep down, it's the echo of your childhood crying out. The longing you feel for the other might actually be a longing for connection with yourself. When you feel rejected, you're often replaying old scenes where you learned love had to be earned. When you're angry because you're not understood, you might be reliving all the times you swallowed your feelings to avoid being a burden. These reactions don't arise in the present. They come laden with the past. The other merely gives form to what's already latent in you. That's why relationships are so powerful. They reveal. They show your fear of not being enough, your tendency to lose yourself, your struggle to trust, your resistance to vulnerability. And sometimes they also reveal your forgotten strength, your capacity to truly love, the sensitivity you've tried so hard to bury. The other can mirror both your pain and your light. This awareness changes everything. Instead of living your relationships as if you're at the mercy of what the other does or doesn't do, you start noticing what each encounter stirs within you. You begin to ask, what I'm feeling now, does it say more about them or about me? What is this relationship showing me that I didn't want to see? Why am I reacting so strongly to something seemingly small? Gradually, the focus shifts from the other's behavior to your own inner world. This doesn't mean tolerating abuse or excusing harmful actions. Quite the opposite. It means developing discernment. When you understand that the other is a reflection, you see the patterns you're living more clearly, and that gives you the chance to break them, to stop repeating stories that always end the same way, to step out of the role of victim in relationships and become the author of your own emotional journey. Some relationships will mirror your shadow, others your light. Some will confront you with your deepest pain, others will remind you of your greatest beauty, but all of them, without exception, serve your awareness. And as hard as it is to accept, even those who hurt you most were instruments of revelation. They showed you where it still hurts, where something's still missing, where a child inside you is still waiting to be held. When you start seeing relationships from this angle, as mirrors of your soul, the suffering begins to transform, because pain stops being a punishment and becomes a call, a sign that there's something in you asking to be seen, understood, and finally set free. Behind many intense loves lies a silent, unconscious search for something missing from childhood, something that hurt and was never resolved, something that made us feel invisible, inadequate, unwanted. And it's precisely that absence that we later project onto romantic relationships. Without realizing it, we cast our partner in the symbolic role of a father who couldn't protect us, a mother who couldn't nurture us, an emotional home that never existed. And we call it love. This kind of love is full of idealizations and expectations. You don't just love the other for who they are. You love them hoping they'll save you, that they'll finally see you, choose you, prioritize you. You love as if shouting, "Stay with me and prove I'm worthy." You love as if pleading, "Do for me what my parents couldn't." But the other doesn't know this. And even if they did, they couldn't give you what you're seeking, because what you want isn't a partner's love. It's emotional repair. The wounded child inside you is still waiting, waiting to be chosen by someone who never chose them, waiting to be cared for by someone who didn't know how. And when you meet someone who, on some level, resembles that figure from the past, whether in their coldness, distance, or emotional absence, you're drawn in, not because they're good for you, but because your unconscious recognizes in them the chance to, maybe this time, be loved the right way. But it's a trap. Redemptive love doesn't exist. No adult relationship can heal the child still waiting for parental love. And as long as you try, convincing the other to stay, begging for attention, tolerating what hurts you, you'll keep reliving the same old pain, because you're not loving a real person. You're trying to rewrite the ending of a story that's already over. You're trying to get now what you didn't have then. This attempt to heal through the other is one of the deepest reasons we cling to those who hurt us. Because it's not just about that person, it's about what they represent. And letting go isn't just ending a relationship. It's releasing an old hope. It's acknowledging that no one will go back and love you the way you deserved back. Then, it's accepting that repair won't come from outside but from within, from your own embrace, your own love. Jung said that every process of individuation requires psychological separation from one's parents, not to reject them, but to stop seeking them in other bodies. This isn't easy. It demands mourning. Mourning, not just for what was painful, but especially for what never was. For the loving father you imagined, for the present mother you always wanted, for the safe childhood you never had. But it's only when you grieve that you start seeing the other more clearly. You stop expecting them to save you. You stop accepting crumbs as proof of love. You stop losing yourself in promises born of your own neediness. And you begin to realize that true love the kind that builds, nourishes, and frees, is only possible when you take responsibility for your own wounds. Relationships weren't made to fix the past. They were made to share the present. And as long as you carry the weight of an unhealed childhood in your heart, you'll keep handing others the responsibility to make you feel what only you can give yourself: self-love, belonging, inner peace. After experiencing relationships marked by pain, rejection, and abandonment, it's common for the mind to craft a dangerous logic. If this keeps happening to me, the problem must be me. This idea seeps in gradually, like a quiet but persistent voice, and you start carrying the responsibility not just for your own feelings, but for the other person's emotional failures too. You believe you were rejected because you weren't enough, betrayed because you couldn't stay interesting, left because you gave too much or too little. This guilt doesn't come out of nowhere. It has deep roots in the earliest emotional relationships you lived through. When a child doesn't understand why they're being ignored, criticized, or emotionally neglected by those meant to protect them, they lack the maturity to conclude the fault lies with the adult, so they assume it's their own. That's how a distorted self-image is born. I'm hard to love. I don't deserve attention. I need to try harder. Time passes, but these beliefs keep operating. And when, as an adult, a partner disappears or treats you with indifference, the wound reopens, along with the old notion that you ruined everything. You start overanalyzing yourself obsessively. You replay conversations, trying to pinpoint where you said too much, where you gave yourself away too soon, where you might have been too intense, too needy, too weak. But all this is just a desperate attempt to explain the pain. And once again, you place the blame in your own hands, just like you did as a child. Jung taught us that the unconscious seeks coherence. It tries to confirm the ideas you already hold about yourself. If, deep down, you believe you're unworthy of love, you'll interpret every rejection as proof of that. If you think you need to erase yourself to be accepted, you'll label any moment you stood up for yourself as a mistake. And if you see love as dependent on your performance, you'll live in constant vigilance, terrified of messing up and being abandoned. This guilt is subtle but destructive. It makes you beg for explanations that never come. It traps you in unbalanced relationships because maybe this time you'll get it right. It leads you to justify abusive behavior, saying things like, "He only acts this way when he's stressed," or "She's only cold because she had a tough childhood." You forgive the other, but not yourself. You understand their pain, but not your own. And slowly, you sink into a dynamic where loving means blaming yourself all the time. But the truth is, not every love that ends is your responsibility. Not every absence is your fault. Not every abandonment reflects what you did or didn't do. Some people don't know how to love. Others are too trapped in their own pain. Others simply can't offer what you need. And none of that diminishes your worth. Freedom begins when you realize that feeling pain isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign you care. That being sensitive isn't weakness. It's strength. That giving too much doesn't make you guilty. It makes you human. And that healthy love will never put you in a position where you have to blame yourself to feel worthy. You don't need to earn love. It's not a reward for good behavior. It's an emotional right that comes from the simple fact of your existence. When this truth starts to sink in, not just understood, but truly felt, the guilt loses its grip. You stop judging yourself for loving wrong and start embracing yourself for doing the best you could with the awareness you had at the time. What hurts isn't loving. What hurts is loving without including yourself in that love. It's abandoning yourself to avoid being abandoned. It's blaming yourself to keep belonging. And gradually, this guilt becomes a prison, but you can step out of it. It starts with a small act. Stop accusing yourself and look at yourself not with judgment, but with compassion. Because you're not broken. You're just learning to love yourself without needing to suffer for it. There's a fantasy many people carry, often silently, almost secretly, that one day someone will appear who finally sees everything no one else has, heals all your wounds, fills every void, and proves that love can indeed fix what's broken. This idea seems harmless, even beautiful at first glance. But beneath it lies a profound emotional trap, affective dependency disguised as romance. This hope for salvation through another usually stems from a very old place. Maybe you grew up feeling something in you was wrong. Maybe you got used to relationships where every scrap of affection had to be earned. Maybe you learned to smile even when you wanted to cry, to stay silent even when your heart was at war. And over time, the idea took root that someone would come to rescue you from all that. Someone who'd love even the parts of you that you can't love. Someone who'd finally make love work. But the problem is, this expectation isn't aimed at a real person. It's a projection of your own need for repair. When you believe love will fix you, you start looking for someone to play the role of healer, not partner. And that creates an unbalanced relationship from the start, because the other stops being someone you share life with and becomes someone tasked with the impossible mission of filling what's missing in you. You begin measuring love by how much the other calms you, protects you, validates you, and any hint of frustration becomes a chasm. Any silence turns into rejection. Any flaw feels like abandonment, because deep down, you're not dealing with that person. You're grappling with the old pain of not being loved as you needed, and that pain turns the relationship into a constant search for reassurance, control, confirmation. Idealized love is fragile. It's not based on the other's reality, but on your neediness. You don't see who's beside you. You see what they could represent, and inevitably that image shatters, because no one can sustain the role of savior for long. When it happens, disillusionment follows, not just with the other, but with love itself. Jung reminds us that wholeness isn't found outside ourselves. The journey to true love begins when we stop searching for someone to save us and start taking responsibility for our own pain. When we realize the only person who can truly embrace us the way we need is ourselves, and that loving another authentically is only possible when we stop demanding they fill what we're unwilling to face. The illusion of love as salvation breeds relationships where too much is demanded and too little is given, where the other becomes an emotional project and affection a bargaining chip. But that's not love. True love arises when two people meet not to complete each other, but to share, not to patch holes, but to walk together, aware of their own stories and limits. Waiting for someone to fix you is a way of staying trapped in the idea that you're broken, but you're not. What you have are wounds that need care, not salvation. You deserve love, yes, but not the kind that rescues you. The love that truly heals is the one that meets you whole, even if still in progress. One that doesn't demand you hide, mold yourself, or pretend to be someone you're not. And that's only possible when you stop seeing yourself through the eyes of those who always thought something in you needed fixing. The most transformative love isn't the one that comes from outside. It's the one that blooms when you decide you're already worthy of love, just as you are. Have you ever stopped to wonder why some stories seem to repeat in your life? Different people, different faces, different phases, but the same emptiness, the same abandonment, the same ending. Sometimes it feels like you're reliving the same relationship with swapped names. And no matter how much you promise yourself this time will be different, it all circles back to the same place. This isn't bad luck, it's a pattern, and its origin lies in your unconscious. Jung said the unconscious acts like a silent scriptwriter of our emotional lives. It crafts stories based on the experiences that marked us most, especially in childhood, and makes us repeat them unknowingly, as if searching for a different outcome. The conscious mind might crave a fresh start, but the emotional body seeks familiarity. That's why you attract what you recognize, even if that recognition is painful. If you grew up having to earn attention to feel loved, you might be drawn to emotionally unavailable people. If you learned that love comes with sacrifice, you'll end up in relationships where you give too much. If you were rejected for being sensitive, you might avoid nurturing partners, choosing instead those who reinforce the idea that showing emotion is weakness. All this happens below your conscious awareness. You don't choose to suffer, but your unconscious chooses to repeat. Unconscious repetition is the psyche's attempt to resolve something unfinished. It's as if, with every new relationship, there's a hidden hope. This time, it'll be different. But without awareness, you end up replaying the same script with the same roles, and worse, feeling guilty, frustrated, broken, as if the problem was solely yours, as if you were doomed to never find happiness in love. But it's not about fate. It's about unseen repetition. And only when you start observing your patterns with honesty and without judgment can you break them. Ask yourself, what's the story that always repeats in my relationships? What do I feel every time a relationship ends? Who from my past does this person remind me of? Not in their face, but in how they treat me. These questions open doors within you, and when a door is opened, the unconscious begins to lose its power. It's important to understand that the pain of repetition doesn't happen because you've learned nothing. It happens because there's something in you still waiting to be seen, acknowledged, embraced. And until that happens, your love life will keep reflecting the past, not the present. The same sensations, the same wounds, the same fears, until one day you say, enough. That enough isn't anger, it's awakening. It's the moment you stop living on emotional autopilot and start consciously choosing who enters, who stays, and most importantly, why they stay. Because you realize you don't have to endlessly relive absence, humiliation, abandonment, and that repeating isn't loving. Loving is recognizing. It's choosing with awareness. It's building something new without destroying yourself in the process. Breaking a pattern isn't simple. It's deeply rooted, sustained by years of conditioning, but it's possible. And it starts with an act of courage, looking inward and asking, with sincerity, what's really been driving your romantic choices? The answer won't come from outside. It's not in the other, it's in you. And the clearer you get about your own story, the freer you'll be to write new endings. Because repeating is surviving, but loving consciously, that's living. After so much pain, repetition, and frustration, there comes a moment when the question shifts. It stops being, why doesn't anyone love me the way I deserve? And becomes, why do I keep loving others more than myself? This shift is subtle but transformative, because that's when healing begins. Not when someone finally chooses you, but when you decide to stop putting yourself last. Loving without abandoning yourself is perhaps the bravest act someone can do for themselves. It means breaking old, internal promises, that you'll only be loved if you're perfect, that you have to earn everything you receive, that being vulnerable is dangerous. It also requires going against years of emotional conditioning where love came with pain, silence, or disproportionate effort. And above all, it demands relearning how to relate to yourself more honestly. It's not an easy change. Often the urge to give too much still surfaces. You still feel the pull to please so you won't be left, to yield to keep the other close, to stay quiet to avoid conflict. But little by little, you start noticing the signs. You hear your body when it tenses in warning. You recognize the anxiety that flares when you feel yourself being swallowed again by that old dynamic. If I'm enough, maybe they'll stay. And that's where something shifts. You start saying no without guilt. You begin recognizing when you're shrinking to fit. You start seeing yourself with more respect, not because the other is valuing you, but because you're tired of neglecting yourself. And that inner respect reflects in your relationships. People who once seemed irresistible start losing their shine. Situations that used to trap you now feel uncomfortable because you're no longer in the same emotional place. This inner change alters everything. You stop seeking constant validation. You stop begging for love. You stop confusing intensity with presence. And you learn to give yourself what you always waited to receive. When you're sad, you hold yourself. When you're scared, you listen. When you're in pain, you embrace yourself. And this simple act of being with yourself starts filling the spaces that once seemed impossible to fill. Loving without abandoning yourself also means accepting that you can feel frustration, pain, and still not lose yourself. It's understanding that some people will leave, that not every connection becomes a story, that not every love will be returned, and even so, you remain whole, because you no longer leave yourself behind. You start building relationships where love doesn't come at the cost of your emotional health, where you don't have to prove yourself endlessly, where there's room for reciprocity, conscious choice, mutual growth. And that doesn't mean everything will be perfect, but it means you're no longer willing to pay with your soul to keep someone by your side. This is the beginning of freedom. When you realize you don't need to repeat pain to feel alive, that love doesn't have to hurt to be real, that your story can be rewritten, not from neediness, but from awareness. And that, before any relationship with another, there's the relationship with yourself, and it's the one that shapes everything that follows. You can keep loving, but now, if you choose someone, it'll be from fullness, not lack. It'll be from affinity, not necessity. It'll be with presence, not fear. Because finally, you've understood. Love begins when you stop abandoning yourself to be loved.